Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consell, your host. Two quick things before introducing you to my guest. First, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast by clicking on the follow button and also clicking on the bell icon so you're alerted to each new edition of the program. Second, in addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you will find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Mark Farrington, who recently retired after nearly 40 years of teaching writing, the past 25 of them teaching writing programs at the esteemed Johns Hopkins University. Consider his accolades. His short fiction has won the Editor's Choice Award in the Raymond Carver Fiction Contest. You can't do much better than that. He was awarded an individual artist grant from the Virginia Commission on the Arts 4 times. He was awarded the Outstanding Faculty Award in the Johns Hopkins MA in Writing program. He won the Outstanding Service Award from the Northern Virginia Writing Project and the Outstanding Alumni Award from the English Department at George Mason University. Farrington grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So it's Farrington, Barrington. We have some alliteration going here. He earned his bachelor's degree in English and American Literature from Colby College, and he completed his MFA in fiction writing at George Mason University. He recently moved to Maine after living for more than 30 years just outside of Washington, D.C. After all that short story writing and teaching, Farrington just published his first novel titled Loss of Life. The novel tells the story of 41-year-old Matthew Winton, who awakens in a Virginia hospital after a car accident and has no memory of his life after the age of 13. Over time, he learns that he is a college professor who lives alone and has no family. He is also a writer, and he turns to his writing first, hoping that it will tell him something about his past. But he has written primarily fiction, and he struggles to separate the blurred lines between fiction and fact. He is helped by a policewoman who investigated the accident, and a relationship develops. There's much more to that storyline, but we'll start there. Mark Farrington, congratulations on your novel, and welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for having me.
You bet. You bet. So, you're a decorated short story writer, but now you've decided to write a novel. And I know from what I've heard over and over again, trying to sell a short story collection is harder than a novel.
Yes.
Did that factor in at all? What kind of motivated you? Was it simply, hey, look, I've retired from writing. I've got time on my hands. I finally have the bandwidth to do this. And why a novel versus a short story collection?
I think that was a part of it, but actually I've been trying to write novels for a long time. The couple that I had tried or that I had worked on before never quite came together. And so, but in terms of the form, it was a form I've always been drawn to. I mean, I prefer reading novels than reading short stories generally, but although I do love short stories, but I found that particularly with my work schedule and everything else that it was easier to focus more on short stories for many years. And you could also try things a little bit more daringly with short stories that if you try something and it doesn't work out, you spent maybe a month or so figuring that out as opposed to spending 3 or 4 years figuring it out. So, but this is a story that has been in my mind for a long time. People ask me how long it took me to write the novel, and I say 5 years because 5 years ago was about when I started writing the actual novel, but it feels like I've been writing this book for 30 years. It's got bits and pieces of things that I wrote before that I liked, but never quite found a way to fit them into a whole. And I was able to bring some of them back in this book.
Now, did you, I'm curious whether you did a full outline of the novel ahead of time, or was it written organically, especially since it was incubating for maybe 30 years?
Yeah.
Was that, how did you approach this?
Well, I had an idea, and the idea was came from an article I'd read in the Washington Post more than 10 years ago about a woman who woke up one morning and had lost her memory. And the doctors had no idea why. I mean, she had not suffered a fall or anything like that, but she didn't recognize her husband or her child. And that really stuck with me, although I had other things I was working with at the time, so I sort of put it away. But now I've reached an age where yeah, my memory can be a little tenuous sometimes. I'll be looking for a word, or I'll see an old time actor on TV and I won't remember their name, and that
Hmm.
sort of thing is irritating. But the older you get, I think it's common um, to be a little bit more wary of it because you don't want to lose that memory. Certainly not the important things in your memory. So I began to think about what would it be like. And I think there's a line in the book where he says, you probably had an instance where you couldn't finish a sentence because you couldn't remember the word. But now imagine that multiplied by thousands where you can't remember anything about your life. Um, and that was the thing that I wanted to explore. Um, the amnesia is actually a vehicle for me. This is not a book about amnesia. I wanted him to have some memory so he can remember up to the age of 13. He's 41 when the book opens. Um, because without any memory, it would, excuse me, it would have been chaos. And it would have become a book that was basically only about amnesia, and I didn't want that. He's a man who has not really been honest with himself throughout his life, in looking at the things he's done, looking at how he wants to spin the things that have happened to him. And I wanted him to do a more honest examination of his life, and so I decided to take it away from him because that was really the only way to get him to go back and look more honestly. So the amnesia itself is a kind of a vehicle, but the first part of the book was me sort of exploring what his life might be like. How does he navigate a world in which, the novel said in 1997, his last memory would have been 1969. So the world that he remembers is almost 30 years um, removed from what he encounters. He doesn't know anything about computers or cell phones or all of that stuff, for instance. And there's a scene where he goes into a grocery and he starts picking things off the shelf that he remembers liking. And he gets to the checkout, and it turns out that his cart is full of things like ice cream, hot dogs, Twinkies, because those are the things that he remembered liking when he was 13. So that was kind of fun for me. It was just creating a challenge. That I tell my students, for instance, if you want to write a character who's 41 years old, you've got to convince readers that they've been alive for 41 years and they have 41 years worth of memories and references and all of these things. And he had none of those. So it was a challenge for me to try to write, and I really enjoyed it. I really got into that, and so the first half of the book was a lot of fun to write, and then I just kind of let that develop. I didn't know where it was going or what was going to happen, but I realized, and this is probably what I had in advance. I had a few sections that I had written about different relationships in his life prior to, or at least, let me put it this way, they were different relationships in a particular character's life who was not necessarily Matthew Winton. Um, but I like those sections, and I felt that they would fit. So I brought those into the book in the second half of the book. In the second half of the book, he goes from Virginia, where he currently lives, to Massachusetts, where he grew up. And he starts looking for the people that he needs to find to help him put back together his life. That the second half of the book was a little bit more difficult to write, wasn't as much fun, but it felt more important for me to be dealing with the kinds of things I wanted to deal with in that part of the book. So there was a little bit of both, but I generally, um, even with a novel, will just let it develop and follow it and try to read it as I write it. So one of my old writing teachers used to say, well, what does this story want to be? Not what do you want to make it, but what does it want to be? What is it telling you it wants to be? And I've always tried to keep that in mind in looking at my own work. That when I teach fiction writing, I'll talk about how, at least for me, it's something of a compromise between those things that you intend to examine and those things that come up within the work as you're writing it that tell you they need to be a part of what you're doing. And so you need to make room for both of those things.
So that implies that the characters start to take on a life of their own, and that they co-create the novel with you. They start to give you some ideas about what direction it should take. Did you have any of that going on to where you felt like the characters were helping steer the boat a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in the relationship that Matthew has with the policewoman. I initially thought that she would be a character who was basically suspicious of him. There's some question about the accident as to whether it actually was an accident. And when I first started writing, her interest in him was more kind of a combination of suspicion that maybe it hadn't been an accident, and also concern that if it hadn't been an accident, maybe he was still having issues that that he might find another way to carry out. So she was not, again, in my first imaginings, she was not a romantic interest, but she developed into one. I guess she decided that she liked him more than I thought she would, and so that whole thing developed, and then I knew, well, I didn't know until it happened, that when he went away, he had to break from her, and partly it's because of sort of the other things that he began to discover about himself. He had sort of kept himself distant from people for most of his life for a number of reasons. And when he first met this policewoman, they developed a relationship, and he was much more open with her probably than he had ever been with anyone else. But then he begins to remember some things that are disturbing for him, and he pulls away from her again. And he goes off to Massachusetts and doesn't even call her while he's away. Although they do communicate again at the end of the book. That's all I'll say about the end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in any sense, did you treat each of the chapters as short stories, Mark? I mean, the novel is obviously it's a marathon versus, maybe you could characterize short stories as sprints. And it can be overwhelming, the idea that I'm going to be hammering away at this thing for 2 or 3 or maybe 5 years, who knows? And to make it manageable, they always talk, aside from writing, people talk about if you have a big project, break it into discrete component parts. Did you bring that to bear, kind of each chapter is a short story in and of itself, or did you just treat it as a novel right from the start and just figure obviously there would have to be continuity between the short stories, so to speak, but I'm just curious whether your short stories chops, that you took advantage of those to help construct the novel piece by piece.
Well, there are certain things that within a given chapter, I think, are similar to a short story, in that my chapters tend to run about 15 pages. That's probably on average for them. And I think that's about the same length, or very close to the length of most of my short stories. So at some level, even though it may not be conscious, I may have been thinking in that kind of a quantity. There's also a sense that that the chapter has to go somewhere. That where you are at the end of a chapter should be different than where you were at the beginning of the chapter. Not necessarily as dramatic as would be in a short story, but still a sense of, for me, my chapters, I like my chapters to basically end, rather than existing as cliffhangers, for instance. I do think of a chapter as kind of a unit. At the same time, there are things when I write a chapter, it often will suggest something that will have to be brought back in a later chapter. So I'm also conscious of that. I mean, I've never written a sequel to a short story, so there's no Rocky II in my background. So when I write a story, the story's done, and if it works, I'll feel like I've basically said everything I need to say about that, and I'll move on. But obviously, with a chapter, that it's just a part, and along with focusing on the chapter as a chapter, you also are always looking ahead. Sometimes you're looking back once you get into the middle of the book, and you got to go back and say, okay, what happened there, or what was he doing there, or what was he thinking there, and how does that now affect the ways he might be thinking today? But you're especially looking ahead to say, okay, what's going to come back? Where is this heading, and what have I just done that I will want to bring back later on?
So you've taught many, many students on the finer points of writing. Talk about how you teach. What are some of the critical points that you make with students, or maybe some key exercises that you assign to them, or most poignant writing techniques that you might convey? How do you go about? Because there are a lot of people out there say you can't teach writing.
Yeah.
Obviously, you disagree with that, and some people have a natural knack for writing. Their brains work that way. Others don't. But clearly, if you give them some tools, they can certainly improve their writing. What do you do in the classroom?
I would say one of the basic things that I think about with teaching writing is that it's true that some people are going to be more attuned to writing than others, but I do believe that most students who struggle with writing struggle because they don't have the strategies to deal with the kind of obstacles that come up when they're writing something. And so a lot of what I teach, particularly at the graduate level, are strategies. Some of these are strategies that I've learned myself through my own writing. Others are strategies that I picked up somewhere from other writers or from books on writing and that sort of thing. But different ways to deal with the kind of problems that come up for someone who is trying to write, particularly write fiction. I teach one of the courses. I'm still teaching, although I'm retired. I'm still teaching a course or two a year, and one of the courses I teach is called Advanced Revision Techniques in Fiction, and there are different lessons that we cover in that class for revision, because I think revision is some people say that writing can't be taught. Even more people say that revision can't be taught, that all you can do is correct the grammar and that sort of thing. So that's been one of my top priorities as a teacher is to help students understand the whole process of revision and how revision is seeing something again in a different way, or adding to what you've already discovered. It's not simply correcting. And so, for instance, one of the lessons we do is on overwriting, and this is something that I started doing myself, where I will write a draft, and I did it first with short stories. So I would write a draft of a story, and the normal tendency after that is to start to cut back, or to look for areas that you need to add a little bit more, but Otherwise, you're accepting the shape and accepting the material that's there. And I decided that what I needed was another draft before I started to cut or even shape the draft that I had. So there's draft 1 and then there's draft 1A. And in draft 1A, what I'll do is I'll go back and I won't even look at the original draft usually, but I'll go back and I will explore different areas that I went over too quickly in the first draft, or things that came up to me after I had written the draft that I hadn't thought of when I was doing the draft. So, for example, I wrote a story once that it was, first draft was about 6,000 words, and I did the draft 1A, and it rose to like 13,000 words. And then I could say, okay, I've explored this as thoroughly as I can and as I think I need to. So now I can begin looking at it and saying, okay, what is the best shape that this has? What can I take out? What don't I need? And ultimately, I think the draft ended up being about 7,500 words. So it got back to where it was originally, but the words that it had in the third draft were better words than it had in the first draft, and the story itself was more fully developed because of that second draft. So I don't know if that makes sense the way I explained it.
It makes perfect sense. There are those who say that, if you're writing a 5,000 word short story, you should really be writing 20 or 25,000, maybe 30,000 words, because if you're not really producing a lot of copy, if you're not letting it rip, you're not accessing your subconscious mind. And there's a lot of things going on subliminally in our brains that can be brought to bear if we allow it to be accessed, rather than, okay, piece by, I'm going to take a pair of tweezers and drop word by word, sentence by sentence in here. And it's going to be 5,000 words roughly. And I wrote 5,000 words, and that's the end of that. We can obviously, when you were talking about overwriting, do you see overwriting as, obviously in this, what I'm talking about is overwriting as a strategy that let's produce a lot more copy and then start to distill it down to its real essence so we can toss out a lot of that verbiage that we created that doesn't really do the work.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I think that is one of those strategies that I do, that I do teach it. And a number of students who have worked that way through this particular class, for instance, will tell me that's become a regular part of their process. And that makes me feel good, because it was something. I know there are other people. This is not an original idea that I had, but it was something that came out of my own writing. It was something that I did. I just dreamed up for myself because what I was writing was a little bit too thin. And I thought, okay, I'm missing all these things. I'm going too fast. I try to write fast in the first draft anyway, but if I go too fast, I'm pass by certain things that are worth stopping and lingering and examining a little bit more. I remember going to a writers' conference once, and Janet Peary was there, and she had been there the year before, so I guess she knew a lot of the people. And she said, she gave it a reading, and she said, I've had a really good year this year. I only threw away 200 pages of my novel. And that, that it sounds horrible, but in a way, that's the sort of thing that happens, particularly with a novel, that if you go off in the wrong direction, you can do it for a long time, and you can end up with a lot of pages. Hopefully, even if you don't use those pages, they teach you something. I developed this theory, which can't be disproven, and it really helps me. And the theory is that bad writing is something that helps you get closer to the good writing. That we all have bad writing inside of us. And so the more you get out, the closer you get to the good stuff.
Yes.
And, as I say, you can't disprove that.
Right.
Maybe I can't prove it, but it can't be disproven. And it helps me a lot. It makes me, it makes me be a lot kinder with myself and more hopeful when I'm writing and it's not going as well.
You give yourself permission to write badly.
Yeah, yeah.
And Brenda Euland wrote a book called If You Want to Write.
Yeah,
And
I know her
you know
name.
that book. Okay. And one of the points she makes is, look, just write it like you speak. For starters, write it like you speak. But she also said, uh, you know, I basically said, I invite you to write badly, very badly. It takes the pressure off, and I think that's what you're indicating. It takes the pressure off. You know it's going to come out badly, so you're not judging yourself at every phrase, and in the end, you produce a lot of copy, and then you can start winnowing away down to what it really needs to be. But I totally get what you were saying, Mark, about the idea that, okay, I've got this chapter. Now I'm seeing some areas in here where it needs to be beefed up a little bit, that I haven't really fleshed this out quite enough. So I'm going to actually add, after tearing away a bunch of copy, I'm going to start to add some copy. So writing is, you talk about sculptors who are additive sculptors or subtractive sculptors. And obviously, if you're working in stone, you're subtractive. But with writing, it's the same way, where you're both. You have to be additive. But then I think a lot of writers struggle with the subtractive part of it. They don't want to throw the words away. It's like, I took time to do this. I worked hard on it. And but that's critical to be willing to, just smash the pot you just pulled out of the kiln.
Yeah, and I tell I will tell students, for instance, before you start to revise something, make sure you have saved a clean copy of the draft you're starting with, so that if you go in the wrong direction, you can just go back to what you had. I have a friend who's a short story writer who has what he calls his 30-day drawer. And whenever he finishes the draft of a story, he puts it in this drawer and he won't look at it for 30 days because he wants to have fresher eyes when he does come back to it. So there are different ways to do that. One of the other revision exercises that I'll do with students is a reverse outline, where I have never liked writing outlines before writing the fiction. I think it may go back to when I was in school, in elementary through high school. The way writing was taught, at least in my school, was terrible. And one of the things that I was taught was to always make an outline before you write, and then never deviate from your outline when you wrote the actual paper. And that drove me nuts because, there's so many interesting things come up in the writing when you're writing. And in fact, I've reached a point now with my fiction that if I'm writing an early draft of something, on any given day, if something doesn't come up that surprises me, I figure it's a bad day of writing, that I didn't get at what I wanted to get at. So the idea of ignoring anything that comes up while you're writing is anathema to me. But I do like outlining a text that has already been written, and so that's what I call a reverse outline, in that I'll have students take a story and then break it into parts and look at each individual part. Part might be a paragraph, it might be a page, it might be 3 pages. Look at each part and say, okay, what is this part contributing to the whole? What are you trying to accomplish in this particular part? And then to even if you can do that, say that in, say, one sentence, take that sentence out and then collect all of those sentences and put them in a line. And number one, you've got the order of your story. So you can say, okay, is that in the right order? But you also can look and say, okay, do I have 2 sections that are basically doing the same thing and I don't need them both? Or do I have something that doesn't belong at all? Do I have a hole somewhere? Is there something that I really need to bring in that is missing? And that's all. It's another revision technique, but it is that idea of again trying to read the text. What is the text trying to tell me? And also how are strangers going to read this? I've read the story 18 times in all my drafts, but that's not going to help, somebody who picks it up in a bookstore and just thumbs through it. I mean, all they have is the text. And I tell students in workshops sometimes, if they want to explain their stories, I'll tell them, unless you plan to travel with your story and visit everybody who buys it and tell them everything you want to explain to them while they're reading it, you got to let the words on the page do the job for you. And so it's good to sort of figure out what are these words saying. And I think probably to get into sort of the larger scale of the way I teach writing as essentially two stages. The first stage is discovery, and the discovery is on the writer's part. The writer sort of discovers what is the story, what is happening, what needs to happen. All of that. Is it a story? Is it, something bigger, something whatever? And then the second part is communication. And the communication part is, how do I present the story in such a way that readers will be affected by it in the way that I want them to be affected? And those are two separate stages for me. And I do think in general, it works best if you separate the two and you start with the discovery and then you move into the communication. There's going to be some back and forth for sure, but primarily I think those are looking at them as separate stages can be really helpful.
Yeah. And your point about well, I lost my train of thought now. But you were saying, I mean, there you are teaching a lot of writers, and these are young writers. What do you see? What have you seen over the years, Mark, that you see as kind of a repetitive problem or the biggest problem among young writers that kind of stand in their way of advancing? Is there some habit that they tend to have that you need to drum out of them?
Well, I think it varies. I mean, for let's see, probably the last 20 years I've been teaching, in the graduate program, and our program is a part-time program, and so a number of our students are older than your typical students. I think probably the average age is around 35 of our students. So their issues are usually probably a little bit different than younger writers. But I think that the number one issue for my students is usually how do I turn off my critical mind? I spend all day at work, being highly critical of this and that and the other thing and analyzing everything, and then I'm supposed to sit down and imagine something and to write about it in a sensory and visceral way, and it's real hard to do that. So that's one of the things that I start with. There's a book that was written back in the 30s by a woman named Dorothea Brand called Becoming a Writer, and she has some interesting little exercises that she does to sort of free in the 30s she calls it to free the unconscious mind, but it's what we would call the subconscious mind today. And that's usually where I will start in the first. There's an intro course called Fiction Techniques in the program, and it's the first course usually that fiction students will take. And the first 3 or 4 weeks of that course is spent just sort of hammering that idea that, let go, let the story tell you some of the things that it needs to be, and you don't have to control it, and in fact, if you only control a story with your conscious mind, that story is almost guaranteed not to be very successful, because art,
as opposed to what, Mark? Only your conscious mind, as opposed to
being open to your subconscious mind, being open to sort of the the rhythms of the universe. I mean, whatever it is, but that idea of going into a piece saying, I know exactly who these characters are, and I've already decided what they're going to do all the way through it.
Mm.
That's trying to control the story. And in fact, I'll have students say, admit that, well, this, I was writing it, but this thing came up and it wasn't anything that I was planning on, so I didn't want to touch it. So I'd get away from me. You're going to ruin my plan. So anybody who writes, I think, can have a plan, and the plan can be as detailed as they want it to be, provided they are open to things coming up that they hadn't anticipated, that they hadn't planned. Because that's, again, to me, that's always been where the best, most interesting things happen. The things that I had not planned on dealing with, or the things that I had never even thought of including. Something happened, and it just brought the piece to life in a way that it didn't have before. I think a lot of my feeling for that is based on my own upbringing, and that I was an English major as an undergraduate, and was focused on things like theme, the theme of stories and all of that, and I did very well as a critical or analytical writer about literature. I went to college at a time when the classics were king, and so I started out with this love of great literature, and it's very hard, or it was very hard for me to just write stories. I mean, I tell students, for instance, that you have to tell stories first, and that Moby Dick, for instance, at its core is the story of a guy with a crazy boss, and you got to be able to tell that story before you get into all the metaphysics and all of the ways to kill a whale. It's a guy who gets onto a ship that's run by a crazy man. And I think so. My respect for great literature, I think, got in the way for me for a very long time, because I knew when I looked at my own writing that I wasn't F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I thought, well, if I can't be F. Scott Fitzgerald, maybe I'm not any good. Maybe I shouldn't even write. So I think for older students, and by older I would say 25 or above, and again, it's not everybody, but for many, what I've seen is this combination of wanting to be in control at all times, and along with sort of a not helpful respect or love for great writing. And when I say not helpful, I mean, I love great writing and I respect it tremendously, but it's not helpful for me to hold that up as my goal in life, to join that group. If I ever did, that would be wonderful, but that can't be, at least for me, that can't be the goal. I mean, the goal is to tell stories as honestly and accurately as I can.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big enough job just to write. I mean, it's an exacting process. And the idea that, well, it's not good enough for me to write. I have to be somebody whose work they're going to teach in literature classes over the next 50 to 100 years. Definitely shooting one's self in the foot. When you talk about outlines and controlling the process, there is, I mean, an outline can be a very heavy outline where they've taken account of everything, or it can be, I've talked to some authors who go with this really lightweight outline. I know where I'm going, or I think I know where I'm going, but there's lots of room within it to have the spontaneity occur and take advantage of that and embrace that and go ahead and make that part of what will become the final product. So I don't know if do you spend time teaching outlines, and what do you recommend to people, and just in terms of what needs to be in an outline, and what are you kind of self-defeating yourself with if you actually include it in the outline?
Yeah. One of the things, there's a writer who I really like, a British writer named Jim Crace, and I've heard him talk a few times, and he talks about how for him, he creates an outline that he thinks of as a fence that kind of fences in the whole property of the novel. And he says that because I have this fence, I don't have to worry about, falling into the ocean. I know exactly where I'm going to be, and that allows me to be as spontaneous and crazy as I want to be within that area. And I thought that was a really great way to think of an outline. And what changed for me as a teacher, I think, is that when I first started teaching, I thought what worked for me will have to work for everybody else, or ought to work for everybody else. And I not only didn't use outlines, I disliked outlines, and often because of my younger experience. And so I thought nobody should ever like use or like an outline. And I gradually learned that it wasn't the outline itself, but certain things within the outline that if it wasn't used in the right way, or if it was used to sort of strangle the story, it was not going to be helpful. But that it could be really helpful for many people if they kept a few things in mind. And to me, the biggest thing is to use the outline as a framework, but not as a dictum.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you get to something in a story as you're writing that comes up, that interests you, but is not part of your outline, try it out, see what happens. Don't automatically shun it because it wasn't part of your outline. The other thing that has seemed to be important to me is not to overly think out moments in a story before you've written them. For instance, I knew in the book that eventually I knew, that Matthew and Sarah, who's the policewoman, were going to have a relationship. And that meant that, after he went away, after they kind of broke up, but not officially, that eventually he was going to have to, or one of them was going to have to look for the other one when he came back from Massachusetts. And I pretty much knew that was going to have to happen. I did not stop and think or try to plan for what they were going to say to each other or how that meeting was going to turn out. I knew that the meeting would happen. I wasn't even sure exactly where it would happen, but I had some options. And so in a way, if I were admitting to myself that I actually did some kind of outlining in my writing, I would have said, okay, in my outline, I knew that near the end of the book, they were going to get back together in some capacity. At least they were going to communicate with each other in some way. But I would not have then sat down and said, okay, let me plan out what they're going to say or how it's going to end up. Because to me, that's too much control. That's not being in the moment. Doctorow has that famous quote about, writing a novel is like driving across country without your headlights. You can make the whole trip that way. And when I talk about that, what it means to me is, in a way, it has to do with being in the moment of where you are when you're writing. If you're driving, say, from Washington D.C. to Los Angeles, and you're in Tennessee, but you're thinking about what it's going to be like in Colorado, then you're not in Tennessee anymore, but you're also not in Colorado. You're kind of nowhere, and
Hmm.
that's not being in the moment. And so those key moments in the story, I think, again, at least in my experience, and it is something that I do encourage students to think about this way. Those key moments are going to work best if you are in those moments when you write them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, when you think about the whole El Doctro analogy of the car without the headlights on, you can imagine the intensity that you have to drive with at night with no headlights. You're absolutely riveted to the road. You have to be in the moment. So that and to try to replicate that in writing, not an easy thing to do, but it's certainly a worthy goal. You talk about telling stories, Mark. Then, what about open endings? Because, I'll watch a movie, go to a movie, watch a movie with my wife, and she'll say, well, what happened to them in the end? And I said, it's an open ending. I said, now we can get a glass of wine. We have something to talk about. We can go get a glass of wine now, and it's open to our interpretation. So let's talk about what we think the writer was pointing to. And, when I think about my favorite novel, White Noise by Don DeLillo, that does not have a definitive ending. A lot of the fiction I read, probably most of it, doesn't have a definitive ending. So people who write literature, let's say, they, I think, oftentimes think in terms of, I'm not going to have the bow tie ending. Is that okay? Or are we a society that, look, I have to have that beginning, middle, and end, or I don't feel satisfied? I mean, it's almost like the good guy, bad guy. If the bad guy doesn't get his comeuppance in the end, you definitely leave the theater feeling unsatisfied, or set the book down feeling unsatisfied. So, what about that? What about a story that's kind of doesn't really end in the definitive way?
Well, I mean, my inclination is to I tend to be or try to be very practical and in some ways very narrow-minded. And so I wouldn't like if I were teaching, I wouldn't necessarily teach the challenges of an open ending story. But if somebody writes one, you know, we would look at it very closely and say, okay, what are the what is going on here? What are the expectations you brought to this story? What expectations haven't been met? And if they haven't been met, then have you been given something else that makes you not mind that your other expectations were not met? But it would all be focused on the one story itself. I get a little bit leery of thinking in terms that are a little bit too, I don't want to say too intellectual, but maybe too broad in their application. That I don't I don't want to be thinking about what might be trendy or what even what I guess I think in terms of expectations when I think about any book or any story, and
The
particularly
reader's expectation or the writer's?
the reader's expectation in terms of what the writer is what the writer is writing. So, for instance, if I'm writing a mystery novel, most readers are going to expect there's going to be a dead body probably pretty early in the book. But if I don't want to write a traditional mystery novel, maybe I don't want to have a body, and that will go against the expectations of many readers. But if I give them something else instead that that gets them involved in the book in a different way, they hopefully won't mind that their expectations were not met and might even be happy that they weren't met because something else came about. One of the books that I recently taught in a novel reading course was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And we talked about how that character that Christopher is the conceit is that he's writing a mystery story, and so he has to have a dead body, and he picks a dog. But it's not really a mystery story. And if you read it thinking it's a mystery story, or it's going to be a mystery story, your expectations are not going to be met, but you're going to be given so many other things that are interesting and hopefully will be appealing and affecting to you, that it won't matter to you that the expectations aren't met. So I do think it's helpful, and I'll deal with individual students this way, helpful for students to sort of understand what they're doing or what they're writing in relation to sort of the world of literature. How does it fit? Where does it fit? How is it going to be categorized? Because they all get categorized one way or another, rightly or wrongly. And to be aware of what some of those expectations might be on the part of readers, but whether you meet them or whether you purposely go against them is really up to you. And one of the things that I come across fairly often in workshops, and I try to correct this in a way, is when you get a student who's writing something that's unconventional, and like all students, they're not doing it as well as it needs to be done. There's a tendency, and particularly from other students, to say to them, well, stop doing that. Just go back and do it in a more traditional way. But when they should be saying, not that, but here's what you need to do more in order to make this unconventional piece work, that go more with it. So my big thing, I think, is to try and look at every piece of writing that a student does in terms of what is it trying to do, and to help it do that better. I don't want to impose my tastes. I don't want to impose my process on anybody else. I just want to help them do what they're doing better. And I've had students in evaluations several students say, I have no idea what kind of fiction Mr. Farrington likes. And I like that a lot, because what it means is I'm not pushing my own taste onto students.
Yes. What is your writing regimen, Mark? When you're going full throttle on a novel or a short story, are you up in the morning early with a pot of coffee? Are you a midday writer? Catch as catch can? Do you feel like it's 11 to midnight is when things really the creativity really comes? How do you work it?
When I was younger, I used to write at night, and then when I when I got a little bit older, it got too easy to talk myself out of writing at night. I would be, I'm tired. I'll get up early and write in the morning. And then in the morning I'd go, well, I'm a night writer. So my process really began to come together when I started writing first thing in the morning. I got up fairly early, and I mean, I have a friend who's a poet who gets up at 4 in the morning, and I can't do that. But I get up early enough. And I'll write before I do anything else. It's when I'm closest to a kind of dream world anyway, and I'm not, my critical mind is not in full gear yet, so it's easier for me to sort of dream and imagine and see things, and not be too critical of myself, and just to go with that. And there are times when I'll finish writing for a day and not, just as I finish, I realize, I just spent 2 hours writing. I didn't notice it when I was doing it. So that's, I try to write every day. I've tried that forever, but I don't always succeed at that. I tell students sometimes when they say, I want to develop a discipline as a writer, what can I do? And one of the things, particularly again, dealing with young adults or even older adults who have a full life in addition to wanting to write. One of the things I'll mention sometimes is, let's say every Sunday night, sit down and look at the week ahead and try to pick out 3 or 4 blocks of time when you can devote yourself to writing, and make an appointment with yourself for those 3 or 4 times, just like you would if it were, an appointment with a doctor, and who will charge you money if you don't keep that appointment. And that gives you a chance to stay close to the writing, which I think is really important, to be close enough. And it also takes the pressure off, because if you have a bad day, you're going to be writing again tomorrow or the day after. But it also allows you to adjust your writing time to whatever works best, whatever is works best within your schedule on a given week. Sometimes, I was teaching, basically evening classes in college, and so most of my days were always going to be free. Most people don't have that luxury, but you might have more time on a Tuesday than you do on a Thursday, for instance, and you can adjust it that way. But in terms of, for me, I like to get the writing done as early as possible. Now, if I'm editing something, or if I'm doing some fairly intense revisions, line by line revision sort of stuff, I'll often do that in the afternoons or early evening, and I do that usually by hand, rather than on the computer.
Gotcha. There was, I forget her name now. Her last name was Brown. She was the head of the Poynter Institute for a while, and she said it's amazing how much you learn when you have to teach. And so this question I'm going to ask you won't land the same way with you, Mark, as it would with your typical author. But I'm wondering if there was a turning point in your writing life, a time when you learned or experienced something that made a profound difference, where kind of turning the corner for you. You learned something about yourself or about the writing process that took you to another level, and maybe something that has abided for your entire career since.
I think that the biggest moment for me, I mentioned how I was taught writing, through high school and essentially pretty much in college as well. And it didn't work for me. It didn't work as a fiction writer. It worked fine as writing papers on stories, but it didn't work as a fiction writer. And so when I got out of college, I thought, I don't want to be a teacher of writing, because the way I would have to teach it isn't right. And I didn't know what was right. I definitely knew it wasn't right for me, but it just didn't feel right. So I left education. I worked for a while I worked as a security guard. I drove a station wagon with special needs kids to and from school for a while, just trying to focus on writing and just make enough money to survive. And then I published a couple of stories in very small magazines, but I wasn't getting where I wanted to go as a writer. And I decided I would go back to graduate school. So I went to George Mason, which is just outside DC. In their MFA program, I worked with Richard Bausch and Alan Hughes, a few other writers. But what really affected me and what really sort of changed my life is an organization called the National Writing Project, which is a nonprofit that teaches teachers how to teach writing. And one of their former directors was at George Mason, and I ended up working with him a lot. And it turned out that their approach was that, well, first of all, they believe if you're going to teach writing, you need to write. So that was sort of a basic principle. I remember having a teacher in high school, a French teacher who was probably close to 70, and she said, when I finally retire, I'll eventually finally get to go to France. And I thought, geez, you've been teaching French your whole life and you've never been to France. But anyway, so that was the first. And then the other principles there. One is that the way to learn how to write is to read the processes of successful writers. And that's something I had started to do on my own when I got out of education. I would read, Flannery O'Connor's letters and all of the everything I could get my hands on to see how they wrote, how people wrote. And the way most writers wrote was very different than the way I had been taught. And that again made me think, well, it's either write or teach. Never both. But this sort of revolution had been going on in the teaching of writing, at least in some of the universities, that particularly those connected with the writing project. And so there was that, and then the whole idea of writing being a process, that if you can separate the processes, the different steps to some degree, so that you have drafting and editing don't occur at the same time, that they use different parts of the brain. And so if you're writing a first draft, you don't want to be so critical about every word. You don't want to stop and correct all the misspellings and everything else. I mean, you can do that if you want, but if you do it and it takes you away from being in the moment of the story, of the place and the character and the emotion, then don't do it at that time. Save it for later. And so that whole process, and the idea of a process, that was what I was reading about. When I would read the works where different writers talked about how they wrote, and so what happened to me then is I realized I could teach writing, and I could teach it the way it seemed to be the right way to teach it. The way that worked. That the writing project and those teachers who are connected with it were doing just that. And there would be space for me if I started teaching. And so my writing and the way I had learned to write, and my teaching and the things I felt it was important to teach others came together, and they became the same thing. And from that point on, I was in my mid-30s at the time. From that point on, I knew I was both a writer and a teacher. And I have found, over and over, that being a writer helps me as a teacher. It helps me both to understand what students are going through, and also it helps me to offer strategies and suggestions that have worked for me or that haven't worked for me. And also that as a teacher, as a teacher, because I was a teacher, I was becoming a better writer, because I've always been the kind of writer who needs to understand what he's doing. As much as I want, early drafts to sort of take on a life of their own, I also want to feel like I can look at a piece of my writing and say, well, how is that working? Or how is that not working? Why is that not working? So that kind of understanding of my own writing has been important to me. And that's something that as a teacher, I get to use over and over again. And so it makes me, having to do that with student work makes me better able to do it with my own work. So from that point on, I think, the writing and the teaching came together for me, and the one helped the other, and that has always been true. The one drawback has been time. That there have been semesters where I was teaching so much, I didn't have much time to write. Then again, there have been a couple of times where I wasn't teaching at all, and I struggled to write because I had too much time. So finding the right balance was always the key. But having them both really, it worked for me so well.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So what's next? Are you working on another novel now, Mark, or are you taking a break? What are you anticipating?
I've got a collection of short stories that most of them are done. Several of them have already been published individually, that I'm putting the final touches on putting together and hoping to get that published. I have I have some thoughts of another of a new novel, but I haven't really done too much with it yet. It's been I've been wanting to promote this book. I like this book, and I hope that I hope that people will get a chance to read it. But it's also kept me sort of focused on this book that I've already written. So I'm talking about it. I was working on a short story not too long ago, and then I did a podcast, and I started talking about what I thought I was talking about, something that happened in the book, and it was actually something that happened in the story I was writing at the time. So it got me a little confused. But I think soon I'll be going back and I'll start exploring this new book. But it'll take me a while to figure out whatever I write. I'll just write blankly for a while, weeks, months, see how it goes, and then at some point I'll step back and say, okay, what is this, or what might this be, or what parts of this might be something I want to expand on, or whatever, and then I'll start thinking about what it could be as a book. But until then, it's just putting words together, writing scenes and things, and seeing what develops.
Yeah, totally understandable. Well, Mark Farrington, again, congratulations on the novel, and thank you for coming on the program and sharing this plethora of insights.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.